I remember the first years of our marriage as the happiest time of my life. We married when I was 23 and he was 27. We were full of hope, plans, and love that seemed endless. His smile, his confidence, everything about him was like a magnet to me. I believed our union was made in heaven. We quickly had children, and I devoted myself to our family. He worked, building his career, while I took care of the house, the kids, and kept our small but warm home in the suburbs of Houston, Texas, cozy. Back then, I thought this was how it was meant to be, that every family was built on love and mutual respect. As the years passed, routine gradually pushed romance aside. He became busier and busier, and I found myself alone more often. I was a mother, a housewife, and although I took pride in raising our children, a feeling of loneliness began to grow inside me. He said he worked for us, for the kids, for our future, but his work was taking away from me the one thing I needed most, him. Over time, I started to notice changes. He came home later and later, grew irritable, and answered my questions curtly. I make the money, and you take care of the house and the kids. That's fair, he would say when I tried to talk about his absence. I still believed he was doing it all for the family, that his heart still belonged to me. But one day, 7 years ago, everything changed. He was about to leave on another business trip, as he called it, for a client meeting. As always, he was composed, professional, even a little distant. I never doubted him. Over all the years of our marriage, I had never once thought he could cheat. But that day, I happened to see his tickets. They had 2 seats. He wasn't flying alone. A cold realization hit me. I suspected who the woman was. She worked with him, and their relationship always seemed a little too friendly, more than it should have been. My doubts grew, but I didn't want to believe he was capable of betrayal. I spent the whole evening staring at the tickets, unable to hold back my tears. When he left, it felt like my life had been torn apart. I cried for 3 straight days. It was a pain that's impossible to describe. I love him, I thought. How could he do this to me? Those 3 days became the longest of my life. I wandered around the house, trying to hold it together for the kids, but inside, everything was falling apart. When he came back, I gathered my courage and told him I knew. His reaction was unexpected. He insisted nothing had happened, that it was just a work trip, that I was mistaken, but I could see his eyes. They weren't the eyes of someone telling the truth. I pretended to believe him, but inside, I was dying. 7 years have passed since then. 7 long years during which I lived knowing that my husband was leading a double life. I saw how he changed, how his care and attention now belonged to her, not me. I stopped asking questions, stopped seeking answers. Instead, everything inside me grew cold. I felt empty. Our relationship became a formality. We lived under one roof for the sake of the kids, for the family that had long ceased to be real. I immersed myself in routine, raising our youngest son, taking care of the house, but inside, there was no more life. After I realized he had someone else, I tried to deal with it in my own way. I told myself to keep going for the sake of the kids, for the sake of the house, to preserve the appearance of a family. But every day, it became harder to do. I understood that he hadn't broken up with her, that their connection was still ongoing. This knowledge ate away at me from the inside. I could no longer look at him with the tenderness I once felt. Every step he took, every delay at work, reminded me that he no longer belonged to me. I tried not to think about it, but you can't escape the truth. I became an observer of my own life. He would come home, eat the dinner I made, sit with the kids, and then retreat to his room, spending time with his phone. Sometimes, I tried to start a conversation to see what we had left in common, but he answered shortly, without interest. Everything that once connected us had disappeared. I was no longer his wife. I was just a woman he shared space with. He didn't insult me, didn't hurt me, but his indifference was worse than any shout. It showed me that I no longer mattered to him. One day, on one of those rare occasions when I decided to take a walk alone, I saw a scene that turned my world upside down. I was standing at the entrance to a local mall, lost in thought, when I noticed a familiar face. It was a man from my past, someone who had once held a special place in my heart. He was helping his wife, opening the car door for her, adjusting her coat, carefully holding her elbow. I watched them, feeling something stir inside me. It was care. Genuine, sincere care. Something I hadn't seen in a long time. This scene made me realize what was missing in my life. I wasn't looking for love, but I realized I craved something more than just an empty existence. I wanted to feel needed, loved, important to someone. We locked eyes, and I knew he recognized me too. Later, he found me on social media, and we started chatting. I never expected it to lead to anything more, but each of his messages felt like a breath of fresh air. He spoke to me the way I had longed for my husband to speak to me. He reminisced about our youth, asking about my life. I spoke about the kids, the house, but said little about my husband. It felt like talking about him would be a betrayal, yet deep down, I knew that our conversation itself was already a betrayal. We met for the first time a couple of weeks after we started chatting. It was an innocent meeting, just coffee in a little cafe near the park. I felt strange, as though I were doing something forbidden, even though there was nothing between us but conversation. But his gaze, his words, made me feel alive. I wasn't seeking physical closeness. I only needed emotions. I wanted someone to tell me I mattered, that I was valued. I longed to hear that I was worthy of love, that someone cared for me. Everything I had waited so long to hear from my husband, I found in this man. Our meetings continued. He was polite, caring, never tried to go further than I allowed. He was the one who reminded me what it felt like to be a woman, to feel needed. Those 3 months were a breath of fresh air in the ocean of emptiness I had been drowning in. But one day, it all fell apart. My husband found out. I don't know how it happened. Maybe he saw our messages. Maybe someone told him. But that night he came home with a stony expression. His gaze was cold. He didn't shout, didn't yell. He simply said he knew. When he said he knew, I felt the world around me collapse. How many years had I closed my eyes to his infidelities? How many times had I pretended nothing was happening for the sake of our kids, for the sake of keeping the family intact? But now, everything had changed. He, the one who had lived a double life for years, was now accusing me of the same thing. It was a strange night. I expected him to yell, to get angry like they do in the movies, but that didn't happen. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, his face unreadable. The silence was heavier than any words. He asked only one question. Why? What could I say? Explain that I was tired of being in the shadows, that I wanted to feel alive, tell him I lacked love and care? I didn't know how to begin that conversation. Inside, I felt a mixture of shame and hurt. I remained silent as he waited for an answer, but my thoughts screamed. That night, we talked more than we had in the past 7 years. He said it hurt him, that he never expected this from me. I looked at him and thought, did you think about me when you were lying to me? Did you think about what it's like to live knowing you're not the only one in your husband's life? He was confused. Perhaps, for the first time in a long while, he felt what it was like to be in the shoes of the betrayed. But even then, he never spoke of his own guilt. His words were focused solely on my actions. He spoke about how I had destroyed the family, how our children didn't deserve this. I listened to him and thought how deeply wrong he was. These conversations continued for several nights in a row. He said he was leaving, that he couldn't be with me anymore, but each time he said that, he stayed. Maybe he was waiting for me to beg him to stay, for me to repent and try to fix everything. But I couldn't do that. For the first time in a long time, I felt free from the fear of losing him. My connection with the man I had met ended the moment my husband found out, not because I no longer needed the emotions he gave me, but because I understood my life was too tangled to invite someone else into it. Despite the pain and chaos, I saw some irony in these events. My husband, who had always assumed I would stay with him no matter what, was now the one fighting for our future together. But I didn't know what I wanted. One of the reasons I hadn't ended things earlier was the kids. Our boys were the meaning of my life, my source of strength. Our youngest was only 3 years old when I learned about his first affair. Now he was older, but still a child who needed a family. I had always believed that despite all the problems, the kids needed a complete family. But at some point, I realized that our family had long ceased to be one. We lived under the same roof, but we were strangers to each other. I was afraid to admit that, by example, we were possibly only harming our children, showing them what unhealthy relationships looked like. My husband stayed at home, slept beside me, but every evening he disappeared somewhere. I knew he was going to her. She was waiting for him, and I felt nothing. It was a strange feeling. The pain I once felt had disappeared, leaving only emptiness behind. But then, one day, everything changed. It happened when, due to stress, I ended up in the hospital. My body couldn't take all the stress I had endured over the past years. I thought he would stay with her, that my condition wouldn't affect him. But he came to the hospital as soon as he found out. I remember his face. He was pale, worried, and for the first time in years, I saw something real in his eyes. He shouted, "Don't die, I love you." Those words spoken by him were like a blow. In 18 years of marriage, he had only said that to me twice. That's when I wondered, maybe it's not so clear-cut. Maybe, despite all his mistakes, he still loves me? Or was it just the fear of losing something familiar? I didn't know what to think. The time spent in the hospital was strange. I felt like I was teetering on the edge between life and death, not physically, but emotionally. My husband sat beside me, holding my hand as though trying to convince me that I mattered to him. It was something new. But despite his efforts, I couldn't shake the thought that this was temporary, influenced by fear and guilt. I looked at him, listened to his words, and conflicting emotions overwhelmed me. On one hand, I wanted to believe that he had changed, that what he felt now was sincere. But on the other hand, I couldn't forget those 7 years when he lived a different life, sharing his love and attention between me and that woman. He said everything was over, that he no longer saw her, that he wanted to fix everything. I silently nodded, but deep down I knew. Such things can't be fixed with words. Love either exists or it doesn't. After I was discharged from the hospital, he tried to surround me with care. It felt strange and unfamiliar. It seemed like he suddenly remembered that I was his wife, the mother of his children, the person he'd spent nearly 2 decades with. but it was hard for me to take his concerns seriously. I felt like a spectator at a play. He was playing the role of the perfect husband, but I knew it was driven by the fear of losing what he thought was his. Or maybe that wasn't it. Maybe he was genuinely trying. Despite his efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness. I looked at him and saw not the man I once loved, but a person who had become a stranger to me. His gaze no longer held the spark that once made me fall in love with him. We continued to live under the same roof. Every evening he came home, sat at the table with the kids, tried to joke and be part of the family. But for me, it all felt forced. Maybe he was trying to make up for his guilt, but I couldn't allow myself to trust him again. Sometimes I thought about the man with whom I had shared those brief months. I thought about what he had given me during those 3 months. Warmth, care, words I hadn't heard in a long time. Those memories hurt because I knew they had been a mistake. But at the same time, they reminded me that I was still capable of feeling. I began to think about what was keeping me in this marriage. I had always told myself I was doing it for the kids, for their well-being. But was that really the case? Or was I simply afraid of change? One day, my older son asked me why I looked so sad. That question struck me. I always tried not to show my emotions to the kids, but apparently, they sensed more than I thought. I told him I was just tired, but he didn't believe me. That's when I realized that our children see and understand more than we allow them to. They never asked why their father was absent so often, but their silence spoke volumes. I began to fear that their understanding of family would be based on what they saw. I couldn't allow myself to stay in this marriage just for them. I understood that the example we were setting was more important than the illusion of stability. I started thinking about what our life would look like if I chose to leave. But fear still held me back. I was afraid of loneliness, afraid of financial difficulties, afraid the kids would judge me. Every time I thought about leaving, that fear paralyzed me. Meanwhile, my husband continued his attempts. He stayed home more often, spent more time with the kids, tried to bring back the family we once had. But for me, it all seemed artificial. Maybe it was because I could no longer see him in the same light. I wondered if I would ever again feel something real for him. Or was our story already over, and I was just afraid to put a period at the end of it? Months passed since I was discharged from the hospital. Life returned to its usual rhythm, but my thoughts remained fixated on one question. Why was I still here? Every day I asked myself this, but I couldn't find the answer. It seemed like I was stuck in my own decision, which had long ceased to be a conscious choice. My husband continued to try. He cooked dinners, took the kids to the park, came home earlier than usual. It seemed like he was trying as hard as he could to show me that he had changed. But the more he tried, the more I felt distant. It evoked nothing in me but indifference. Sometimes, I felt like I had become the woman who watches her life from the outside. I saw him playing with the kids, laughing with them, as the family became whole again. But what was missing was sincerity. These weren't the moments I could call happy. It was more like a play, where he was performing his role and I was performing mine. My older son began to ask more and more questions. He was old enough to understand that something wasn't right. One day, he asked me why his father always looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching. That question took me by surprise. I didn't know how to answer. Maybe he was waiting for my forgiveness. Maybe he was afraid of losing the life he thought was stable. But I couldn't return what had already been lost. I often wondered what my life would have been like if I had left then, 7 years ago, when I first found out about his affair. Maybe I would have already started a new life where I could feel happy, or maybe I would still be trapped in doubts and fears. That question remained unanswered. My younger son was too small to understand what was happening. His world still revolved around play, school, and evenings with the family. He was the one I feared taking that step into the unknown for. I couldn't imagine how his life would change if I left, but at the same time, I understood that by staying here, I was hurting both myself and him. One of the hardest parts was that I had stopped trusting my own judgment. I no longer knew what was right and what was wrong. I tried to find answers in books, articles, and other people's stories, but they all felt so foreign, so far removed from my reality. Every piece of advice sounded like a template that couldn't be applied to my life. Sometimes, I remembered those brief 3 months when I felt alive. They were so fleeting, but so vivid. It was like a flash of light in a dark room. And though I knew that experience had been wrong, I couldn't forget what it had been like to feel that I mattered to someone. I knew my life couldn't remain as it was. But every time I thought about leaving, I encountered a new wall. Fear. That was what held me back. Fear of loneliness, of the unknown, of what would come next. I was afraid I wouldn't manage on my own, afraid that my children would suffer. One evening, sitting in the kitchen, I started writing a letter. It was addressed to myself. I wanted to pour out everything that had built up inside me over the years. I wrote about how I felt betrayed, about my pain, about how I had lost myself. The words flowed from me as if I had finally allowed myself to acknowledge everything I had been hiding. I didn't finish the letter, but the process of writing it became the start of something new for me. I realized that maybe I needed to begin by forgiving myself for the mistakes, for the weaknesses, for allowing myself to stay in this situation for so long. The next day, I decided to talk to my husband. I didn't know what I was going to say, but I felt that I had to do it. He deserved to know that I couldn't live like this anymore, that I no longer felt for him what I once did, and that I needed time to figure things out for myself. When I started this conversation with him, I felt ready for anything. I could no longer pretend that our marriage was alive or that I still felt anything for him. I looked him in the eyes and spoke about how difficult it was. I spoke about the pain he had caused me over the years of cheating, about the emptiness I felt now, about how I had tried, but I could no longer do it. He listened silently. His face remained unreadable, and only at the end, when I said I was leaving, did I see his eyes darken. He didn't try to stop me. He didn't beg or get angry. He simply said, "Do what you think is right." Those words struck me with their coldness. I thought he would fight for me, for us, for our family. But he didn't take a single step to keep me. I stood up, gathered a few things, and left. On the doorstep, I looked back at him, but he didn't even glance my way. That was the end.